Yeah, if we do breakout groups or something like that, we can pause it. Come on in, Sandy. So we'll go get started. We have some people in the sanctuary and some people on Zoom, so we'll record it so that people can watch it later. And if you're on Zoom, like we really do want this to be a conversation. So let me get the chat up. So if you're on Zoom and you have questions, please just kind of type them in or interrupt or something like that. It's informal enough that we can kind of figure that out. So we're all here because as parents, come on in. Besides our spouse, obviously the most important human being people in our lives are our kids. And if you guys are anything like we are, like we have no idea what we're doing a pretty good chunk of the time. I still remember, you just remember as a parent, it's nothing like being a parent to make you realize how much help you need as a parent. Like I remember when we brought Simon home from the hospital, so he's our oldest, and I drove like 10 miles an hour home from the hospital, and we brought him and we put him in his crib, and he was so little, and even just his baby size crib seemed so big. And I just remember thinking like, the hospital has made a huge mistake in sending them home with us because we have no idea what we're doing. And, as they get older and you go through different stages, you realize, yeah, every stage there are things to learn and try to figure it out as you go. And we're not here like to have these conversations because we have some kind of secret formula for parenting. Actually don't trust parenting formulas anyway. If you ever like find a book or a counselor or somebody who says like, this is, somebody's in, I need to let in, this is the way that you need to rate, like you should run away from those people. There is no formula. But yeah.
Yeah, but we all still need help. So even though there's not a formula, just having conversations, knowing what resources to access, looking at good mentors, all of those things are helpful. And so that's what our idea is today, not to give answers, but just to have a conversation where we share things that we've learned and you all share things you've learned, and hopefully just kind of get the conversation started. In the last, I don't know, several months, Mike has told me, and I've also had conversations with moms of people saying, oh, this is challenging. I wish I knew more about this. I could use some help with this with my kids. And just thought, let's just get together and talk about it and maybe open up things that we can all use some more help in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as we think about it, like the way you get started as a parent matters. And again, if your kids are a little older, it's never too late to restart. But I think about trying to get started well and how important that is. Like I have one older sister who lives in New York. And actually Martha and Tessa just went to visit her last week. But I think, okay, if I want to drive and visit my sister, like it's not that big of a deal if I make a wrong turn, like in lower Manhattan, because I'm kind of in the neighborhood, I'm a little bit lost, but it's a bigger deal if I take a wrong turn on I-5, like when we get out there, because then you can really end up going in the wrong direction. And you think about it, like knowing what you're aiming at with parenting is really important. I was reading somewhere that like if a plane is leaving the West Coast and they're flying to New York, even if the plane is just like a half a degree off, which in the size of a plane translates to like less than an inch as far as the way they're aimed, like by the time they get to the East Coast, they won't be in New York, they'll be in Washington, D.C. And so just like figuring out, okay, where are we going and what, what's going to help us get there? What are we aiming at? And then how do we as parents keep adjusting along the way? As long as we kind of have the goal, the true north in mind, we can adjust as we go.
Yeah. So Mike and I were talking about like, okay, so where are we going with parenting? What is that goal, right? And I think we can all have lots of different goals with our kids. We talked about, we want to raise responsible, healthy adults, all this. But really what we boiled it down to is we want to have ongoing, loving relationships with our kids. Because whatever mistakes they make and we make along the way, that's what's going to give us the greatest potential for impact in their lives if we continue to have ongoing loving relationships with them. I think of that with God, with us, right? That's what he wants with us too. Yeah, sure. He wants us to be obedient. He wants us to be, full of joy and patience and all those things. But the number one is that ongoing loving relationship. And so for us, that's what we want with our kids. And, you all may have other ways of framing it or other goals. But for us, that's what is kind of the mark. There are lots of different models and approaches for parenting. We don't actually have like a framework that we're bringing tonight, but there are some really good ones. I'm going to just talk about a few parenting resources that we've come across that we appreciate. Leslie Adams actually presented, and were some of you here when she presented? She did a really great job. She's a parent coach. She's a licensed counselor, and she presented this discipline that connects with your child's heart. And she's going to be here next week. And yep, thank you. So,
Of course, it's
but
backwards on
that's a
Zoom,
great
but-
framework that might connect with you. There's also Love and Logic. I actually went to a seminar. I can't remember a lot about it, but I know from other Christians that it's been super helpful for some people, biblically based, and I think research based as well. We have 3 teenagers in our home. So The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. I just finished this book. Not a Christian book, but very research based, evidence based. And I found it super helpful in that it lines up, I would say 85% with what I believe. Some of the things that might not be faith-based, I might be off on, but most of the things about really connecting with your kids were right on. She has 30 years of experience with teenagers. So if you have teenagers, that's a good one. And I'm finishing reading this one, which is for girls in particular, about how to help girls in the church in particular grow up without some of the toxic messages that have been prevalent in Christianity, or really with biblical. It's called She Deserves Better. And good conversations to have with your daughters. So, because we want healthy boys and we want healthy girls and we want healthy men and healthy women and healthy marriages. So these are just some of the resources that we've seen. Mike's gonna mention this one too.
Yeah, so this is a book that just came out, Parenting, Getting It Right by Andy and Sandra Stanley. That's hard to say 3 times fast. Like, I've not actually read this book. He is a pastor that I appreciate, and I've heard him like in podcast interviews and things like that about the content of the book. So I'm familiar with it in a sense. I have always appreciated his approach to things. Don't always agree with everything, but I appreciate the way he goes about it. And one of the things that's helpful, at least in this book, is it tries to sort of break parenting out into stages. So for them, they say, okay, like kind of birth through 5 is kind of the discipline stage, like when you're really, and they discipline kids for disobedience or disrespect or dishonesty.
Giving boundaries.
Yeah, setting those boundaries. And then between like ages 5 and 12, you're kind of training your kids, right? You're helping them understand the why behind the what. And this is something we never did, but they talked in one of these podcasts about how like they would practice greeting guests when they came to their house, like, so one of the parents would go outside and ring the doorbell and open it up. Cause yeah, I mean, I don't know about your kids, but like kids naturally around adults are like, or like today on the phone. Oh my gosh. Like we're going to really try in this to not like call our kids out by name, but like, we've just noticed that kids today have very different phone etiquette.
But they don't talk on the phone.
Yeah, because they don't ever talk. They just text.
So we'll hear them with a friend like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah, what? Okay, click. And I'm like, wait, did you end that conversation? Like, yeah, did you say goodbye? Hello? So kind of trying to sort of model some of that. And then they talk about how as your kids get older, like move through the later teenage years, it's really more about coaching, about connecting and then letting them experience some of the natural consequences for the decisions that they made. And then kind of being able to move towards a friendship with them as adults. And again, there's nothing like magical about that framework. That's just one that they have. And we just think it can be helpful to have some kind of framework in mind. Otherwise, you're like, where am I as a parent? Like, what is going on with my kids? What are the things I'm supposed to be focusing on at this stage? So just having some ideas is good.
And again, for us, resources that give ideas and suggestions, but are humble and say, don't say this is the way to raise Christian kids. Those are the ones we trust, because people think they have it all right. They're hiding something. So, or they're proud and don't know what they don't know. So,
yeah.
So those are some resources, and you guys may have some others, and when we have some discussion time later, we'd love to hear other resources that have been helpful for you all. So for the rest of the time, we're going to talk about just some principles that have been helpful for us.
And those are listed on the handout that you have. And if you're on Zoom, I just put a PDF of that handout in the chat room so that it's there, so you can kind of track along with that if you want to.
Yeah. And these are not at all exhaustive. Hello, come on in. They're just some things that we brainstormed as we were thinking about this. We're going to brainstorm later, principles that you all have in your marriage or in your parenting that are helpful to you. But these are things that we've learned throughout our 18-year journey of parenting from our own parents, from mentors, people that we really admire in the church, from good resources, from trial and error. So just some things that we've found to be helpful. And the first one, of course, is that even though we're privileged to have these children, they're not ours. And God ultimately, is in charge of these people. And I think that's helpful as we make mistakes and don't see them exactly where we want them to be, always to remember, okay, they're not finished. Even when they leave our home, they're not finished. God continues his work in them, in spite of us sometimes, because of us sometimes, and so just always keeping in mind, I mean, I know some of us were not raised in homes where parents did a very good job. And yet here we are by the grace of God and working hard to help our children. So that's a good first principle to remember.
Yeah. And another thing, and again, these are, if you have comments or questions, feel free to interrupt, or if you're online. Yeah.
This good mother. Yes, but that's coming later, Kai. You're jumping the gun, but yes. Yes, you can.
Yeah, you can jump in, but you can't steal our thunder before we get there. We only have like 3 decent things to share.
Yes,
okay, so don't. Yeah. So and again, these are just principles that we have learned sometimes the hard way that we are trying to live out with our kids. And one of them is that your kids need to know that they're loved by you no matter what. That there's nothing that they can do that's going to be like, I'm done, I don't love you anymore, you're out of the family. And you see that in like big ways and small ways. Like sometimes, little kids it's like they're testing, to be like, hey, I did this little thing, or I stole a piece of candy and I want to tell you about it. And some of it is like almost like a test to see how are you going to respond to this. And I think about examples in my own life of that. I think I told a story a couple of weeks ago in a sermon about how when I was in middle school, I went through a shoplifting phase. I was just getting a 5-finger discount on all sorts of things. And I remember like I had felt really guilty about it and felt like I needed to tell my parents. But I wasn't afraid that they were going to be like, we're sending you to juvie, you're out of the house. Because all throughout my life, like when I had done things wrong, and I did plenty of them, they were able to sort of separate the wrong behavior from who I was and the fact that they were loved. And that's continued on. I mean, even as an adult, it was after we were married. We'd been married for about a year. And I let Martha know that I was really struggling with pornography. And she was like, oh, you need to tell your parents about this. And I'm like, but ended up.
I need support. You need support. We all need support.
But ended up doing that and really was kind of ashamed personally to tell them about that. But I wasn't at all worried that they were going to be like, we're done with you. So whatever you can do to make sure that your kids know that you love them no matter what, like that helps provide this really secure base for attachment and things that Martha will talk about.
So attachment, and which is where your comment comes in, Kai, is that kids need to know that they're safe with us, right? They need to know that we are a haven for them. But that doesn't mean we have to do everything perfectly. There's lots of research that started even, I think in the 50s, that talks about good enough parenting. You only have to be attuned, which is basically responsive to your kids' needs and connected to them 30% of the time for them to have a secure attachment, which is a really bad grade, 30%. But to me, that was so freeing to think, I get it wrong all the time, but I think I get it right 30% of the time, you know? And beyond that, you know, I'm studying marriage and family therapy, and I just love, I love seeing how things that have been, you know, biblical knowledge then is reflected in research and vice versa, and can complement each other. But you know, that research has shown it's good for kids to see that you're not perfect, because relationships aren't perfect and they're not going to be perfect in their lives. So it's good for them to see, okay, just because they don't meet my needs perfectly all the time doesn't mean they don't love me, doesn't mean they're not there for me. And then, you know, there's repair, which we'll talk about later, but just being a safe person. This is something that when we had little kids, we just said, we want our home to be a safe haven. That doesn't mean shutting out the world, but it does mean that when they come home, they know, okay, I can let them be myself here. I don't have to put on masks or anything. So that's really important. One of the things that a mentor of mine said when she had teenagers that has stuck in my head was, you know, when you have teenagers, there are lots of times you just have to arrange your face in a pleasant way. And I thought, oh my gosh, that is so true, because things they do or say or whatever, and your brain's doing this, and so you're just trying to, you know, you're like, oh my gosh. But again, we don't want to flip our lids and get crazy on our kids. We want to say, okay, all right, tell me more about that. You know, what are you thinking about that? And then later you tell your husband, let's go on a walk.
Yeah.
You know, that's where you can go. But part of safety is not, you know, trying to not always be flipping your lids, and, you know, they don't think that we're going to be yelling at them. So being safe people.
Yeah, and because a lot of times too, kids, again, it's sort of a test, or our kids sometimes will let us in on the things they're thinking about and struggling with by talking about a friend. Like, so Dad, I have this friend at school, and can you believe what they're doing? And you have to be like, oh, really? It's the same, the pleasant face thing. Because if you freak out at what their kid's doing, they're like, well, I'm never telling Dad about that, you know, when I start doing that.
Or not telling them that it's me, actually.
Yeah. No, so that is a big part of it. And having some, we'll talk about community later, but having somebody, whether it's the person you're parenting with or someone else who you can just debrief and process with. Yeah, we had some other friends in Oklahoma who we connected with them. They were retired by the time we met them, but they had twins who were adults. So we have twins, so we would commiserate. And their twins were hellraisers. I mean, like really, like they would figure out ways to break out of the house. I mean, all this stuff. So the parents ended up investing in a hot tub, and they put it like 40 feet away from the house, because they realized like that's as far we can go there and turn the hot tub on, and the twins can't hear us when we're talking about them. So they had sort of discovered you know, their way to be able to do that and to have that safe space. So the next idea on that sheet is, at least we found out, like it seems like about 95% of parenting is
and we just make numbers.
Yeah,
up.
yeah, exactly. There's no research. So 95% of parenting is just being around for the 5% of the time when your kid actually wants to talk to you about something that matters. You know, parenting is really not so much about competency as it is about just engagement and availability. You know, it's a little bit like, have you guys seen The Incredibles? There's that great scene in there where like the mom, you know, she's got the elastic arms and the kids are all going crazy, and the dad's in the other room reading the paper, and she's like, Bob, it's time to engage. You know, and just that idea of staying connected, which isn't easy to do if you've had a full day at work, or you've been running errands, or you've been homeschooling, or whatever you've been doing, because you're like, I don't have a lot of bandwidth left. But I think about, like with Simon, there was a stretch in his life when he was all about basketball. And I do not know how many hours I spent standing underneath the basketball goal, just returning the ball to him as he was shooting. And we would talk about what Kevin Durant was doing, and this is happening in the NBA, and this is happening. And like, none of it was, you know, important, but you log all of those hours for the time when he's like, so Dad, at school today, this happened. And you're like, oh, okay. You know, that's why you're just putting the time in to be around for when they do want to talk.
And actually, that's something, I say it's not research-based. It actually is research-based because she talks about that in here. You know, she's a psychologist that has a very busy practice and speaks, but she talks about like dinner cleanup. You know, she takes her earbuds out and just kind of, her kids just know. that she's-
Martha that I have met. Watch.
Is that somebody asking the question?
I don't think they were asking a question. I think it was maybe talking in the background.
Oh, okay, okay. So, but she just does the same thing, just being around. And actually, studies have shown that like for toddlers, there's this idea of
They're driving.
the toddlers keep looking back, hello, at the mom, you know, to be able to go out. And they found that the same thing is true of teenagers. Like, they don't really want to engage with you all the time, but they want to know that you're there. And so, you know, if you're in the kitchen, they might come by and say something once in a while, or they may not, but it's still important to their ability to go out and be independent, to be able to come back to you, if that makes sense. So, yeah, that's hard, you know, that's hard to do, just to be available, but, taking my earbuds out, just hanging around, you know, especially those key moments. I think of the key moments, like when kids get home from school, when they get up in the morning, you know, making use of those times when they're coming in, just to even say, give them a hug, you know, say, how you doing? Even if they say, fine, whatever. For our teenagers, it seems like bedtime is always when they want to talk. And that keeps getting later and later, which is hard for us, but totally worth it because they're not going to be here forever. So,
Yeah. No, and that's, I mean, that's not on this list, but that's another thing to remember. Like, again, actually, I think it was Andy Stanley. Years ago, I heard him saying something about parenting. And he said that a lot of parenting is saying no to some things for a season. But just remembering that with kids, like the season that we have with them is short. It seems forever long, especially like you guys, like, man, kids, it's just like, it's like, we will never get through this. But like our son turned 18 a couple of weeks ago and it was like, you have got to be kidding me. Like it just happened,
Yeah.
you know, he was just born.
we just brought them home.
Yeah. So
Anything so far? Any questions, any comments so far about? Okay, we'll keep going then. Most big idea things. I grew up in the time of where like, you would go away for a weekend with your mom or your dad and they talk all about sex and everything, you know, and my mom did that with me. And that's fine, but we found, and I actually did a weekend with my girls, but it wasn't the first conversation we had. And it wasn't the last conversation we had. We found personally that most big idea things, big important things are better as many conversations over time at age appropriate levels rather than the talk for whatever it is, right? I mean, I remember even like Simon, the twins were like 4 and Simon was in like maybe first or second grade.
Yeah.
And they were talking about wanting to marry each other. You know, one of them said that. And then the other one said, you can't marry me. We're both girls. And Simon's like, well, girls can marry each other because he'd heard it at school. And I thought, you know what? Yeah, let's get this started. And so I just said, you know what? Some women do marry each other, you know, and we are loving and kind, but we believe that God's best is one man, one woman. And we'll talk about that more later. And they were like, okay, you know, I mean, again, I coined the term.
you did coin the
Coined
term.
the term, the mommy tunnel, because, you know, when I was pregnant with Tessa, where do babies come from? It's like, well, vagina is a really big word for these little kids. So let's talk about the mommy tunnel, which is where the baby comes out. And, you know, and I talked about daddy putting his penis in the mommy tunnel. And they were like, okay, they were 4 and 6 when Tessa was born. And so it wasn't gross. It wasn't weird. And then throughout the years, as then they'd have more questions, they weren't new terms. They weren't new ideas. Obviously more in depth as they got older, and it was just kind of touching on it. But lots of things we found. You can just kind of start where they are and just have lots of conversations so they know oh, this isn't off limits. This isn't weird. My parents aren't like, oh, why are you asking about that? So that's what we've found.
Yeah, and before anybody thinks they're gonna steal it, the plan is to copyright the phrase mommy tunnel. So that Martha can write a children's book someday and we'll make our millions off
Yes,
of that,
make our
I'm
millions with the
sure,
mommy
the
tunnel
mommy
book.
tunnel. Sorry, I just completely went down a.
Sideways,
Yeah,
yep.
so back to the list, that's probably a good way to keep doing this. So again, community matters.
Mhm.
For you all as parents and for kids. Like one of the things that was the most helpful to us early on is we were part of a small group in the church that we were a part of. And like everybody was in the same stage of life, so we were all kind of having kids right around the same time. So everybody, we could kind of sympathize with each other and like, oh, you're not getting any sleep either, or this, or my kid's got, this horrible diaper rash, like what do you use for that? And we decided that Boudreaux's butt paste was it worked best for our kids. So having some people that you can share like the practical nuts and bolts with is good, but also just having some people that you can share like who love you and who love your kids.
Mhm.
So if you say things like, oh my gosh, my kids are driving me nuts, they're not going to be like, hold on, I'm calling DHS right now, because they understand and they're there to support you in that. And your kids need that too. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we think being involved in a church community matters. Because, not everybody at Suburban believes everything about every detail, but we do tend to have some common values.
Mhm.
And especially when you're thinking about parenting and raising kids, common values around things like, honesty or whatever that might be, like just knowing like, okay, we know we have a lot in common with these other families. So there's a shared understanding of things. And that can be really, really helpful.
Mhm. Well, I mean, I was even maybe a couple of years ago, our twins are 15. A couple of years ago, another mom texted me and another mom and said, my daughter's wanting to wear like one of those crop tops. What do you think? And so we were just able to share our like, we just say, raise your arms. And if it doesn't show, nobody signed up to see your breast area. But if you show a little bit of belly, whatever, you don't have to be covered up all the way. And so again, just normalizing some things and not making it crazy, like one way or the other, just kind of helps to have people you trust to check in with and say, is this awful? Is this okay? What do you think? And again, we won't agree on everything. But it is good to have community. And our kids, I mean, Simon, I was talking to him just the other night about social media because he's 18. So he goes back and forth. He makes his own decisions about social media at this point. And sometimes he has it. And then he thinks I'm wasting too much time and he takes it off. He does that, which I think is super healthy for him to kind of manage it. But one of the things I appreciated was that I said, do you have any friends that are not on social media? Because he was saying, I feel left out. And he said, yeah, actually this guy that goes to youth group with me, that's a super close friend. He doesn't have social media. Well, how does he manage that? How does, is he okay? Is his social life okay? So it's good for them to know they're not the only ones that are doing a certain thing or not doing a certain thing. So community matters. Self-care. I kind of hate that phrase, honestly, because it's kind of a buzzword that sometimes just makes us feel guilty that we're not checking another box. But at the same time, we can only love our kids if we are in a decent enough place ourselves, right? Like we can only, if our cup is completely dry, bone dry, it's going to be hard for us to get out of that. And so I don't think of self-care as getting a massage or, necessarily exercising every day, but I do think that we need to care for ourselves because Jesus did say, love the Lord your God and then love others as you love yourself. Well, as you love yourself is part of that equation, caring for yourself, loving yourself, whether that means going to counseling or whether that means trying to get a good night's sleep. Even though Simon, we often talk to our kids and do all that and sacrifice a little sleep. There are nights when we say, guys, it's 9:30 and we're going to bed. So we love you, put yourselves to bed. We can't have conversations tonight because we're just exhausted.
Mhm.
So again, there's not a formula for this, but you all know that if you're in a really bad place, it's just really hard to give to others. And so whatever that looks like for you is important. And again, for people, especially who grew up in homes with difficult things, we might get triggered by some things that our kids do because they are amazing at figuring out that one place, pushing our buttons. And so being able to figure out, okay, how do I manage that? For me, sometimes it's just been screaming in the car, at nobody in particular, by myself. But whatever you need to do, it's just important for us to be in a good place. But at the same time, this kind of goes back to that good enough parenting. Repair is huge. Like the research is it just talks so much about repairing with our kids when we mess up is like foundational for that relationship. It's better than never making mistakes. Saying, let's do that again. I'm so sorry that I just yelled at you. I'm so sorry that I didn't respond the right way. And I often say that when somebody comes in and says something and I'm like, and I can see their face fall and I'm like, I am so sorry. I'm tired and I did not respond the way I wanted to respond. I apologize. It's amazing. At least our kids, they are super quick to forgive us and to let us restart. But making sure that we go back to our kids and acknowledge we messed up, that's super important. And it happens to be super biblical too.
Yeah, and Martha was saying the other day, the research shows that relationships are actually stronger if there's been some of that repair than if there's never been a fracture, which is not saying like, you should go screw up with your kids just so you can apologize to them. We'll all mess up plenty of, without doing it intentionally. But I think there's really something to that also because it models for our kids, like it's okay. There's a right way to respond when you mess up because they're going to do that in relationships too. And like for better or for worse, like we learn our parenting stuff from what we see growing up. So what a gift to be able to give our kids, whether that's in your marriage or in your relationship with them. Like I to this day, I remember there was a time in high school when I don't even remember the details of it, but I felt like my dad had lied to me about something. And I was just like crushed. But I remember him coming into my room, like I can picture like the sheets on the bed and all that stuff, the way the memory works. But I remember him coming in and just saying, I am so sorry. Like, I see how what I said, I didn't follow. I just am really sorry about that. I want to apologize. Will you forgive me? And like, I don't remember what he said, like that made me like what he liked, but like, I remember that. And it was something that strengthened our relationship. But again, like for him, he's got to be in a decent enough place to be able to do that, which is why like I remember before I was a parent, like, when you ever fly on planes and they're like, in case of sudden cabin depressurization, this will fall down. And they were always like, if you're traveling with a small child, put your mask on yourself first. And then before I had kids, I was like, whatever, I don't need to pay attention to that part. And then when I had kids, I was like, there's no way I'm going to do that. Like if it's me and one of my kids on the plane and they drop down, I'm putting the mask on the kid first. Right. But the idea is, if you're not getting oxygen, like you're not gonna be able to get the mask on your kid because what good are you if you're all so that idea of trying to make sure that self-care is a part of it is important. And then kind of the next point on the list is like there really is no formula. There's no formula that works for every family. There's not even, unfortunately, a formula that works for every kid in the same family because every kid is different. Like even Maggie and Lucy, like so are identical twins. So same genetics, right? So the whole nature nurture debate, same nature. And it's basically been the same nurture. It's not like we decided, let's do an experiment here where we love one and hate the other and just see what happens. We'll do our own twin study, right? So they have the same nature and the same nurture, and they're still different girls. Like their personality is similar, but like we have to engage with them differently because there's just something about the unique spark that God has put in them of their identity and who they are. So there are general principles you can try to apply, but figuring out how to translate that principle for that kid in that situation. It's just always a little bit different. And some of that too is knowing that every parent is different. So like one parent may handle certain issues or situations better than the other parent does. So something may come up, and there've been a number of times where it's been like, hey, Tag, you're in, either because like I'm mad, and if I talk to this kid now, like there's gonna be a whole lot of repair that's got to happen later. Or like, hey, you're the one who's going to school for marriage and family therapy. So I feel like you maybe have some tools for this that I don't have. So just, yeah, so that I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as well.
And honestly, I don't know if anybody here is single parenting, but that's something that we've thought a lot about, because we do tag team a lot, like, okay, you're on because I'm hot right now, and
Not all the time.
no. That's a mic thing. I'm angry right now. Does that work better?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. But I have thought, like, single parents, they don't often have, often they don't have that. And so as a church community, and my heart goes out to them, and just figuring out how can we support each other in friendships as well as in marriage relationships. And it's never too late to start or to restart. I have increasingly been talking, because of my age and stage, but to parents of adult children. And just recognizing that parenting is forever, until we die, we will be parents. And our kids will need us in very different ways until the point where we need them, but this relationship is ongoing. And it's been such a joy for us. We've had the privilege in churches and also just in some personal relationships to see adult relationships that have really been broken off with parents, where they haven't even spoken for a couple of years. That now we see, oh my gosh, they're working on it again, and they're talking again. So, having that reality check of, okay, where are we? There's no vitality without reality. Like, where are we as parents? And Mike and I, as we were talking through this, we thought, okay, what are we doing well? What are we doing not well? And then just saying, okay, how can we course correct right now? What can we do even though we have 18, 2, 15, and an 11? We're not at the toddler stage going, what do we want for our children? In the next 18 years, we're thinking we only have a little bit of time until they're out of our home. So how can we course correct, add, subtract, whatever it is?
Yeah, and it is one of those things, like Martha is saying, is we talk with more parents who are adults. Like I remember before we had kids, like the lady I shared an office with, like her kids were high school, college at the time. And so as we had kids and started working through kind of the little kid years, she was sort of navigating, my kids are getting married, they're, this, and I would like listen into phone conversations and realize like, oh, it's not done when they graduate. And it's true. I mean, like the first time we bought a house, like it's calling my dad. I'm like, Dad, I don't know what half of these words mean that the realtor keeps saying, do I need to do this? And even like I still get a text message. So my parents are 2 time zones ahead of us. So they're 2 hours ahead of us. I still get a text message pretty much every Sunday morning from my mom saying, hey, I love you. I'm praying for you. I'm looking for, because they watch the sermons, I'm looking for it. Even when the sermon the week before has been lousy, she's like, it was great last week. I'm looking forward to today, so that, and like, there's a part of me that still wants to hear that, I mean, so that the task never ends, and sort of being connected with them never ends.
Which is wonderful. That's the ongoing loving relationship. Instead of thinking, oh my gosh, this is never over, we can think the stages of not sleeping, the stages of spending thousands and thousands of dollars on food, all of those things will end. But the loving ongoing relationship is for a lifetime.
Yeah. And I remember, again, when our kids were little, this was when we were in Oklahoma, like I worked for a guy who was a psychologist, and he's a pastor. And that was kind of something he talked about, like, trying to be in relationships for the long term. And I remember there was a lady who worked at the church part-time, and her kids had gone through the youth group when Martha and I had been serving with that. So we knew her kids. And one of the older kids was getting married and had called to let the parents know, like, hey, you know, my fiance's got a job in New York City. We're moving in together, you know, 6 months before the wedding. And we know that goes against your values. And anyway, so she just came in to talk to me about it because her husband was hot, like angry hot, not hot like Martha hot. And basically he was like, I can't believe she's doing this. Like, this isn't how, like, I'm not paying for this wedding. We're not going to this wedding. And I said, you know, I'm not a parent. I mean, I don't have kids that age yet, so I don't know how to advise you. But just from what I've seen, like, what do you need to do now to maintain a relationship with your daughter so that 5 years from now, when she's struggling and hitting some roadblocks in marriage, she'll be able to come to you and talk to you about that? Or so that when she has kids and she wants to say, like, what kind of butt paste did you know, like, what do you do? It doesn't mean you always approve of everything that your kids do. And especially as they get older and they're able to make decisions for themselves, like we probably all know people who they choose very different roads. But you go back to that, how do you help them know they're loved no matter what? And how do you just stay in a relationship so you can continue to invest in them in the ways that God invites us all to do, however they may choose to respond.
Mhm. And, you know, one of our relatives married somebody that was not a Christian, definitely somebody that we were like, red flags are all over this relationship, you know, and we went to the wedding and it was hard because it was not the kind of wedding we would love for her to have had, and yet we were there for her. And she told us years later, after they got divorced and everything, she's like, I knew 100% that you didn't agree. I knew 100% what you thought, you know, but I also knew that you loved me and you were there for me and it meant so much. And to me, I'm like, that is what we want. If we're going to err on one side, let's err on that side rather than on make sure they know what we think, because they usually do.
Mhm. So what we want to do now is have some group discussion, and I think we may even try to just do it live in the room and for people on Zoom. So if you're on Zoom and you want to say something, you can just kind of type it in the text and then we can let you speak. Because I think it's a decent enough group size that we can just do that. But the questions that we're going to talk about are on the back page of that handout. So in this first one, it's basically just, so out of the conversation we've had so far, which admittedly has been a very one-sided conversation. What stood out to you and why? And then as you think about some of these principles that we laid out that have tried to shape the way that we've gone about parenting, you know, are there other principles that are really important to you and that you've applied in your family and that could really be added to the list and would be helpful for that? So just want to have some time to discuss those questions
Thoughts.
or thoughts.
Comments.
And we'll try for the people who are on Zoom, like, so if somebody in the room speaks, we'll try to repeat what they said so
Right.
that you can hear it. Otherwise, it's a little tricky to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so either what stood out to you, or are there other principles that you found to be really helpful kind of in your journey as parents that you would add to the conversation?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm a parent of two little kids,
Mhm.
little kids, and a parent of two older kids. I have two kids, almost 30 and 33.
Okay.
And my daughter and I were estranged for a number of years after my divorce.
Mhm.
And in fact, what's interesting is at the time we were getting married, he was telling me encouraging me to continue to try to keep that relationship with my daughter going. And it was very hard. We were there were a number of reasons for it. It was not a pretty end to my previous marriage. And so we went for a number of years where we really didn't speak at all. And it is coming back around and it is better. She lives in town and she just actually had a sleepover with our daughter Abigail. And so, yeah, I wish I had done a little bit more of the continued pursuit of that relationship rather than just sort of letting it go, which is what I decided to do. And I probably would have come back around maybe a little faster if I had.
And yet now, again, where are we now? And Lord, how can you help me be faithful and continue that relationship now? So, yeah, thank you for sharing that, because that is a unique thing to have the older kids and then to have the younger kids that you're thinking, okay, what do I want to take from parenting them? And what, and what things do I want to do differently with these kids, right? Yeah.
I wish I had heard these things. I mean, a lot of this is familiar now, but this is not what I heard when I had little kids. You know, when I had little kids, it was, they need to obey right away, first time with a happy heart. And as Christian parents, that was like, we felt like the whole world was watching how our kids were, how obedient they were, how, respectful they were and all this stuff. And it was just a really heavy burden. And, so yeah, a lot of repair had to happen later as I was like, oh my goodness, I have wounded these poor little people with this burden of, instant obedience all the time. Come on, kids. And then I was like, wow, I'm not instantly obedient to Jesus all the time. Like what? How can I be expecting more from them than I'm as a, 30-year-old or whatever I was, so I appreciate these principles because there's a lot more faith here and room for the Lord to do his work and a lot more honesty in this. Like, I'm broken, you're broken, all God's children are broken, just like this is more the reality that we live in. I appreciate that.
Well, and our church is not perfect. No church is perfect. But one of the things that we really want to create is an environment where people know none of us is perfect, our kids are not perfect. We're not perfect. But we're all working together and towards the same goal, which is, again, not looking a certain way. That's what the Pharisees did. It's the ongoing loving relationship where we are growing little by little, right? I tell my kids, you're allowed to make mistakes. You're allowed to be really mad at me right now. That's okay. You're not allowed to punch the wall, and make a hole in it. But I mean, you are, and then you have to fix the wall. But
We've learned a lot about drywall repair over the years in the
it
kingdom,
hasn't always been anger. Sometimes it's been a foot that, through.
and it hasn't always been the children. So there you go.
Sure. But
Sermon, Mike.
he wants to know the whole
I
story.
can't tell stories about Martha and her rage at some sin. No, and it's interesting. I mean, even if you think about like what we're trying to do with our kids, as far as just raising them, as the goal, like it helps us to think about the goal is the ongoing caring relationship. And it's really similar when we think about, okay, what are we trying to do in terms of raising our kids in the faith, right? The goal is like, what do we do to give our kids the very best possible opportunity to honestly have an ongoing loving relationship with Jesus and follow him in whatever world they're going to live in, which looks very different than our world. We're going to talk some about technology in a minute, but I remember when Simon at one point, he felt like he was on his phone too much. And he was like, Dad, what did you do to not be on your phone so often when you were my age? And I was like, well, I took it and I hung it up on the wall and I walked out of the room. And he just looked at me like, what is this? So we went and watched like Ghostbusters or something. I'm like, this is what phones were like when Dad was a kid. But the world that our kids are living in is really crazy and complicated in ways that it wasn't for us. So I don't want to tell my kids like how to follow Jesus in 1984 when I was 8. It's like, okay, how do we give you the tools to be able to pursue a healthy, ongoing, loving relationship with Jesus, whatever the world changes, because the world they're in now is going to be different in 5 years and 10 years. So it's that same goal about how do you keep the relationship connected and moving forward.
And admitting that we're still learning too, I mean, we talk about technology, but we've told our kids like, gosh, there's some decisions we made that we would have done differently because we didn't know all the research yet. The research wasn't even out yet, and so yeah, we're going to talk through technology a little bit in a minute, but it's like we messed up because we didn't know everything at the time. And we're sorry, but we did the best we could, and let's move on now together. And I think they really appreciate that honesty. Because they know we're not perfect. So it's good when we can recognize that too.
They pick up on that pretty quickly.
Yeah. Are there other principles that you all have thought in your own family that are important to your family?
Principle is a good word.
It is. Value? How about a value or something?
What comes to mind just from my own upbringing, what are the things that my parents did that was maybe challenging, that it required some effort that they did because it was a conviction? And I haven't made those same decisions, but it's just interesting to see that them living out their faith involves taking steps of obedience there. And it's interesting because it's not the same things that we've decided to do for Sandy and I, but it's just at the same time, just to kind of think back to like those things.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah, and being consistent in our convictions. I mean, one of the things having pastors' kids that is super important. I was a pastor's kid and a missionary kid. I want my kids to see the same person on Sunday morning that they see like Mike tells, hot mama jokes at home, just like he does here.
Mhm.
And obviously we're not exactly the same because it's a smaller time, but we don't want our kids to feel like it's a show at church. Right? We are who we are. And when we fight and, we'll tell people at church, like, yeah, this wasn't a great morning. Like we didn't get along very well. And just, obviously there's some private things, but to me, it's really important that there's not a persona, Christian persona, and a other, what's real. Like we are who we are.
Yeah, and you think about what's unique about being a pastor. Like, we don't want our kids to feel pressure like, oh, well, we've got to behave because it reflects bad on mom and dad. But the same is true for people who aren't pastors, right? It's, like
As we were saying, yeah.
it's people are watching. So years ago, somebody said this, I can't remember who said it, or I'd give them credit. But they said, it's really important with your kids to make sure, like, we love you for your first name, not for your last name. Right? It's not about how you reflect back on the King family that where our status of you rise and falls. Like, we love you because you're Simon or Maggie or Lucy or Tessa. And like, I just remember, because I think it was right around when I was going into ministry and was kind of wondering about the whole pastor kid thing.
That was Andy Stanley.
Oh, was it?
Mhm.
Man, I steal all the good stuff from him, apparently. So, yeah. Would you want to do talk about the technology
Yeah.
part?
So what we thought we'd do is kind of talk about, like, take a topic and then kind of go through these principles and see how they apply kind of to that topic. Because the truth is, we're all trying to navigate, like, for us, when they were little, it was like, okay, so what does discipline look like? As we love them, but we are setting boundaries. How can we do that? And then technology was a big one as they got older. So there are all kinds of issues, but just kind of seeing, all right, how does this apply? Is it on?
What are you looking for?
Page of principles. Here. Okay, so. Okay, so always keeping in mind that God's in charge. And this one in particular is one that Mike and I would do a little differently if we could go back. Because we know the research more now and we understand more things, right? So we'll just tell you what we did. For us, it was important that our kids didn't receive their first access to the internet when they were 18 and leaving the house. because we wanted to be there for them when they started this, right? But it was also important to us that they didn't have access too early because that's difficult too. So we gave Simon a flip phone when he was in 6th grade, that he was able to text like ABC, just because his practices were running late. And so that way he could text us or call us. Turns out that he could still access the internet on that phone. And he actually got like porn on that phone, not because he wanted it, but like it came to him.
Mhm.
And so again, we had no idea. I thought I was getting him the most basic, nothing phone. And he was like, Mom, I'm, oh my gosh. And then in 8th grade, we gave our kids a smartphone. And in 9th grade, we gave them social media. We allowed them to have social media, always with access to their devices.
Like we had
We have
access
access
to
to
their
their
devices.
devices.
Yeah.
And the deal was, we put in like parental safety stuff so that they couldn't get the, bad content. And we had the password like screen times and stuff like that, right? When they were little, like Tessa, she doesn't have any screen time during the week because we want her to come home and actually play after school. But then she gets an hour and a half Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So, little things, people do it differently. What are things that we would do differently now? We would say you can never have a device in your room. That's something that it didn't even occur to us. We said, let's take them out of your room at night. But the more I've read and the more I've learned, just if you make that something from the very beginning, never have a device in your room, then it makes common spaces more where your kids hang out. Like our kids, we talk about everything, and I really trust that they're not doing bad things on their phones, but they're lying on their bed with their phone rather than lying on the couch where I am in the kitchen, where we can just kind of be together. And, when they do, and they say, oh, Mom, there's a funny cat video, I can watch it and enjoy it. And it's more of a together thing. So that's just something I would change. I probably wouldn't give anything until our kids were 8th grade. That's just me. But again, it was kind of necessary because of sports things.
And we did a better job with, like, we tried at the beginning to set as a boundary, like you can't have a screen in your room. And then COVID hit and they sent every kid home with a screen and they all had to be on it at the same time for school. So we tried to have 4 of them in the living room with 4 different, and it was just
Right.
chaos. So unfortunately, that kind of opened the door to so now everybody's in their room because they need it for school. And again, this is not the world I grew up in. We rented a VCR for my 10th birthday party or something like that, if I remember right. And for them, it's but that didn't do us any favors, but still,
Yeah.
it would be something
But-
we do differently.
So we did some things that we would keep doing. I still think for us, it was important to give our kids access to things while they're in our home so we can walk through it with them. And we talk a lot with our kids.
And some of that is because we probably don't, I went to a Christian college and there were some kids that I met who it was the first time they had ever been away from their parents. And it was I got no guardrails now. And they just kind of went off the deep end, But then you also have kids that you see, they're 5 years old and they're just surfing the internet all day long for whatever. So it's okay, how do you give your kids the appropriate amount of freedom to work on devices and things like that so that by the time they're adults, they can hopefully manage that well. And sometimes it's giving the cord and sometimes it's, oh, we got to pull some of that back. And then always just talking about it along as you go.
Yeah. And, looking through this is an area where we've really had to trust God, because the fact that my kids saw porn in 6th grade, that was not my plan. That was not what we wanted. And so just saying, gosh, Lord, please protect him, protect our girls, because our girls also have gotten things like that. So again, this is a place where we can do our due diligence and responsibility, but then we also have to trust God with our
Mhm.
kids, right? Knowing that they're loved no matter what, and that they're safe with us, arranging our faces. I'm not gonna name names because our children have all done good things and bad things, but there was some lying and some sneaking and some things that happened with technology with some of our kids that was really rough, and trying to figure out how to say, okay, you're not bad, but this is really unhealthy for you. This is really not helpful for you. And doing this over the course of a year or two,
Mhm.
and continuing to stay close, continuing to, you figured out the password, didn't you? Let's
Mhm.
talk about this, because that's really like lying, and deceit. And, I use the phrase, you can't have a relationship unless there's trust, over and over and over, just like, hey, I love you no matter what, and I want the best for you. But when you're deceiving and lying to my face and going behind, like, that just breaks our relationship, and that's so hard. And so people ask me, what's the biggest thing about parenting? I'm like, oh my gosh, the conversations and the listening ad nauseum, right? Forever and ever and ever. Being around, like, if you just don't know what your kids are doing with technology, you're just gonna miss it, right?
And it's really helpful having them around because like they know it better than you do. I mean, like clearly, like there'll be stuff on my phone sometimes. I'll just start handing it to the kid. I'm like, can you fix this? And because they're much more native with that. And again, like you do the best you can to do screen time and parental controls and all of that. But like a really motivated kid is going to be able to outsmart you on technology. I mean, like David works in IT, so maybe not because you've got some professional training in that, right? But for most of us, so it's just the being around, like, so that when they're looking at something and they laugh, you're like, oh, what are you laughing about? And maybe it's a funny cat video or something like that. But then again, every once in a while, that sparks a conversation, not about cats usually, but just about, oh, well, it's interesting that like that musician that you like now has a song that talks about this. Like, what do you think about that? Or, why do the kids at school seem to like that song? And it's just being around to keep conversations going.
And that's been hard for me because especially in the area of technology, my preference would just be to shut it down. Like, that's where I come from. And my default is to see it all as negative. And so I really need to be around when it's stuff that they're just enjoying, that's just harmless, so that I can try to step into that. Because it's not helpful for them to think that everything they enjoy, I hate, right? So if I can invest a little time in the cat videos, or my girls, for some reason, are really into taking horrible, horrible pictures of themselves and of everybody else where we look horrible, where my nose is like this giant. And they just giggle and just roll around on the, floor laughing at how our dog looks, Anyway, if I can enter into that, they're a little bit more open when I say, hey, you're spending a little too much time, or this is not really positive for you to be engaging with, because they know it's not just mom hates everything, it's okay. I really want your best. I'm guessing the boys are going to start running
Yeah,
around in just a second.
Kim's closing the doors because the Nerf
Yeah.
war is about
The
to
war is
come
about
in.
to start.
But even, oh, yeah, was somebody gonna say something? But even like the principle that the big idea things, like it's better to have lots of conversations than one. We've tried to do the same thing with technology, at the age that it's appropriate, so, hey, like, what's the downside if you're on this too much? Like with our youngest, it's like, we want you to be active and play, and you're in school and you've got homework, and as our kids have gotten older, like, Simon is like, he does all this research on like dopamine in your brain, and, social media works this way by kind of trigger. So like we have more conversations about that. Like Fortnite, was a big thing for lots of kids. Martha's brother works up in Seattle, or used to work in kind of the greater tech industry. And he was like, oh yeah, the guys that design that, they intentionally try to make it addictive by triggering things in your brain. And, you know, so just having conversations with kids about like technology is not a neutral thing. You know, so like it's like if there's no product that they're selling, you're the product, right? If it's free, they're getting something out of you. And the longer they keep your eyes on that screen, the more money they make. So they're going to do that. And just so we have much more in-depth conversations about different things now that they're older and think about that stuff differently.
And again, because we started in 6th grade and it was a real struggle for a while, we've seen the progression and we're so thankful because at first it was more us putting the boundaries and explaining why we were doing this and what we wanted for them, but they were still trying to get around that, you know, and then now to the point where Simon is saying, okay, you know, he's self-policing and self-thinking, I like the connection, I miss out on things if I'm not on it, but at the same time, I don't feel good when I'm on it. So, you know, what do you guys think I should do? Well, son, you're 18, you know, and you're putting out some really important points. And I don't feel like there's one winner, but you know, what do you think? And are you praying about this? Like, what do you feel like God's leading you to do? So much more nuanced conversations now than when he was in 6th grade and we were just kind of like, oh my gosh, did you figure out my password? You know, but it's the same things that we were saying, just at different levels. And then seeing, oh my, okay, it actually kind of paid off. Thank goodness. Thank
We
you,
hope,
Lord.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, and that is the thing too, like with parenting, gosh, so much of it is like when you see like the little wins, you're like, you know, like the kid who would always like snap at somebody, when you see them actually stop and think before they speak, you're just like,
Oh my gosh,
It's-
it works.
it's working. It's working. It took 19 years, but yeah, and things like that. I mean, man, you need those little bursts of encouragement along the way.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, yeah, and community matters. I mentioned that Simon's friend isn't on it. Again, if not all of your kids' friends have social media in 6th grade, then they will be okay with not having social media in 6th grade. So, you know, some of those things. The self-care piece, this was an area where I needed a lot of self-care because it was pretty intense for a couple of years there. Where I even had, you know, relatives that were like, hey, I think your kid got onto my device in the middle of the night, you know, I'm like, okay, let's deal with this, you know?
Yeah.
There are some seasons that are just hard and intense. So yes, I did some screaming in the car. I did some, you know, punching pillows and lots of praying and, but I'm still here.
Yeah. And with that too, like you gotta deal with your own stuff, you know, like we tell the kids like, hey, you know, let's not be on screen at night when we get home so that we have time together. And I don't know how many times like we've been at dinner and like I'll have my phone in my pocket and it just vibrates and it's like, I'm a pastor. Maybe that's a really important tech. I should definitely ignore my family and do this. And it's not. It's like my college friends being like, hey, dude, do you remember that one time when I jumped off the balcony? You know, and it's like, okay. So, I mean, like it has been personally challenging, but it's in a good way to be like, look, kids, here are some things that are healthy in terms of your engagement with screen. And I'm not practicing what I preach. Like I need to do that. This would be healthy for me to do that too.
Yeah.
So even like at one point I was giving them permission, you know, like, hey, if you see me with my phone out, like I'll give you $1. And then that didn't work because I ran out of money. But just, you know, how do we work on it together? Again, because like I'd never had a smartphone either until they came out. It's not like I learned how to deal with it before I was a kid or when I was a kid.
Yeah.
So
I think that's kind of a general, like, these are general principles, but we try to apply them in those different areas, you know, that are important because each stage you're like, oh, what do I do about this? Right. And so just trying to keep those general principles in mind have helped us navigate it, and obviously not perfectly, but they've been helpful for us. So yeah.
What do you do with different kids at different ages? Like I feel like we're way more lax now with our younger ones than we were. I don't know, I don't think that's actually good for them, but like, how do you like hold the
Hold the line.
line.
Yeah, so the question was,
Your other kids, are they like, well, hey, he got it in sixth grade, so I should get a phone in sixth grade too, like, how did you?
yeah, the question was, how do you deal with kids at different ages and stages and being consistent? Because, yeah, because kids have a hyper overdeveloped sense of justice, right? You're like, well, he got a phone at sixth year or sixth grade, but it was the second week, so it's the third week of school. Where's mine? No, and it is, I mean, we've talked before too. I don't know if that's something we would try to do differently, but it's like our youngest has seen movies, not like The Silence of the Lambs or something like that, but like she has seen movies that our other kids probably didn't see at that age. And some of it is with parenting, sometimes there's a trade-off, right? Because we tried to do family movie nights, on Fridays for a while, with pizza and a movie. And then at some point you get to the stretch where there's like a 6-year gap between your oldest and your youngest. It's really hard to find a movie that works for everybody, but we really wanted to value that time together. So we would say, well, maybe a little bit too old for it, but she'll be okay. And
So we gave up family movie night. We
yeah, so
don't do family
eventually
movie
we
night,
just gave
or we
up
do
family movie night.
family game night, or we do other things. We taste colas and decide which one is the best one or whatever, you can get creative.
Yeah, but even family game night can be hard.
Yeah.
Because
She always loses. 'cause she's
she loses at most
younger.
things.
And so then, she is sometimes in tears because I lose all the games. So like, it is challenging when you have a larger spread of kids. And again, talking a lot, there are some things that I try to hold really firm, like technology is one that I try really hard to stay firm with Tessa, even though I've let Simon go, just because I think that's so important. She goes to bed later than my other kids did at that time. I don't think that's something that's gonna kill her. You know what I mean? But I do, and sometimes she says, it's not fair. And I'm like, you know what, honey? This is what we did with them at your age too. So we're trying to introduce it little by little. I think honestly for us, what's been hardest is that there are friends that have social media. And so she gets on social media with other friends. We kind of have tried to do the same thing with her that we did with the older ones. But yeah, so it's an ongoing challenge. And as you say, like raising the first and raising the last is a little bit different, especially if there's a bigger spread. And it's just going to be, and you just have to figure out, okay, which battles are we really going to invest our time and energy in? And which ones are we just going to say, you know what, he's the youngest and he turned out okay. And, the oldest ones are going to be a little bit more responsible and, that's okay too. So it's not a good answer, but it's kind of, that's how we've done it. I don't know if anybody else has input on the first, on the last. I mean, I look at some of these families, Oregon, I don't know if Oregon, but Suburban has some very large families. And so, some of my friends that have 7 kids and they're like, oh yeah, it's different one with the first one, that's with the last one. It just is, the last one we just dragged around to everywhere because that's how it had to be. Like, okay,
I mean, we have big enough families that like our youth pastor has 2 of her sisters in the youth group,
yes.
right? Because she's the oldest and the youngest
They're
2
the
are in the youth
youngest.
group
Yeah,
with her.
yeah.
Do you guys have other questions? So we've got about 10 more minutes before
8, yeah.
before 8. But this is designed to be the first of 2 conversations. And these 2 conversations are not designed to be the be all end all of things. Like if there are questions we can talk about tonight, but also we are trying to figure out, and like we were talking with Kim about this and like Carrie Penner and others, and just like, okay, what questions do you have either related to tonight or like what can Suburban do to help you to partner with you in the work that you're doing to raise your kids? Where are the particular points of pain or challenge where, maybe there could be a class, or it could be, hey, we can connect you with a parent who's 30 years down the road and has been through that before, or, Maybe it's something that's better handled in a small group or connecting with some of the resources we have, like counselors in the church or Leslie Adams, who's a parent coach. So that's definitely something, if you have thoughts on that, we would love to hear that about how we can be helpful. Or if you have specific questions tonight, we can try to answer that too. So Julie, I know you had your hand up.
Suburban, but it was tagging onto Kai's question and something you started to talk about with technology, and then you said with friends and the friends technology. So we're just starting to run into, because I have a 10 and a 6-year-old. So the times where you have the 10-year-old's friends that come over with their cell phones. So I loved it where the other day, the 6-year-old was like, Mommy, you wouldn't believe it. You should go in there right now. They're watching videos. And so then I had to be like, okay, friend, like, hey, I didn't know you had that. Let's put that on like, so I wondered, we're just entering the friend world of technology, bringing things in, plus entering the friend world of like having friends over more kind of thing. And like, I always hear about being the cool hangout house, and that's a little intimidating because I don't consider myself that cool. And so just like friends and technology is the main question.
I am of the opinion that you show your kids' friends care and that, you know, you're glad they're here and you're kind and welcoming. And it's your home and it's your rules. And, you know, my daughter, again, they go up and do social media and when they close their door, I'm happy to go up there and be like, hey, we're not gonna be on phones right now. Like, hey, do you guys want to go out to jump on the trampoline? Our kitchen is a mess a lot of the time because kids are making cookies, because they're doing things. And, you know, I have to remind myself as I'm stepping in green frosting, carrying it around the house, you know, that's more important than cleanliness, right? Having creativity. But I definitely think that we can show care. Like, I think some kids would value having a parent that's actually interested in them and like, oh, tell me about your school and all that, but also says, oh, I'm sorry, we don't do technology, you know, in our house right now or whatever. The hardest thing for me is that we have a neighborhood where kids go back and forth a lot. And so because I've set these rules, sometimes they go to other homes that don't have the same goals. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And so one of the reasons Tessa has a Gab phone, which does not have internet access. It's just a texting thing. And one of the reasons is because she tells me when she goes from house to house in the neighborhood. So when she goes to a home that I know, like I don't know these parents well, or I know that these kids have social media, I know where she is, I can say, hey, you know, I need you to come home now or whatever. I also know which ones of my kids tell me things and which ones don't. And so like with Tessa in particular, she is the most honest child ever. And so she will tell me, I mean, just last night, she came home and she was at a home where they don't have phones, they don't have anything. And I was like, great, you know, but then she came home and she's like, so Mom, I've been texting with this boy that I don't know. And I'm like, what? You're in 5th grade. She's like, because my friend met him and got his number, but she doesn't have a phone. So she wanted me to text for her. And again, the text was, hi, who are you? You know, and then she lied and said she was this other girl. And then it was, dude, where did we meet? I shadowed this girl at school. Oh. I mean, that was their.
Clearly, the friend made a big impression on this guy.
So, but you know, again, I know Tessa, so I'm not as concerned as I am with some of my other kids that are more sneaky, and I know that about them, right? Because she'll tell me, and I said, oh, hon, you know, that's not okay. Like, I just don't want you, one, you're lying, you're pretending you're somebody else. And two, you're texting a kid that I've never met and you've never met. So we're not gonna do that. And, you know, I just realized like Gab has this thing where I can make it where you have to ask every time you put a new contact on there. And I've been lazy and I haven't done that. That would have given you a really good out, wouldn't it? If I had that on there, so you would have had to say, oh, I've got to ask my mom if we can text this kid. And then I could have said, no. And, because again, for her, she didn't want to look uncool and turn down her friend. And so not overreacting, again, arranging my face and not saying, you're doing what? You're you're lying and
Texting a
some
boy
kid
you've
that I
never
don't know."
met? It's
Yeah.
probably a 47-year-old guy in his mom's basement in Cleveland.
And it's not a big deal. But it is something that you have to be aware of. It's actually why my kids didn't ride the bus. Because when they did, for a little bit, I heard about kids that were on their phones and they were seeing things and words that were getting said and, okay, I'm just gonna be one of those moms that takes my kids to school. And that's okay. We make those decisions for our family. So does that help at all?
How you present that balance, like, hey, this house is what we do.
Mhm. Yeah, and we have always, I think we would always sort of default to, we'd rather have our kids' friends over because then you're just aware of what's going on. I mean, like one of the best ways to get to know your kids' friend, like there's this stage when they start doing activities, but they can't drive yet, where you are like, you're just driving your kids all over the place all the time. But if you're a smart parent, you say hi to everybody and you just stop talking. And after about 30 or 40 seconds, it's almost like they forget you're in there. And then you just sort of listen to the conversation and you're like, okay, I'm gonna have to ask what that word means, or like, apparently I need to listen to that song, and you pick up on a lot of things.
Yeah.
Not,
And unfortunately, because we don't allow some stuff, like at the point in time when some of our kids got older, they did want to go over to some other kids' houses. But again, it's that trust, it's the balance of trust and boundaries, and it's an art, not a science. It's a trusting God and then, let's pull the rein in just a little bit. But with the younger kids, I found being as kind as possible and non-judgmental in the way I present it, just like we don't do that right now. You guys were at school all day. We don't need phones right now. We need to be outside. We need to do something creative.
Mhm.
Or if you want to be on screen, do Just Dance on our Wii because you're actually moving around and it's something that's not, so there can be ways that we don't do video games, but we do these interactive things occasionally that are just fun. Like we've done Just Dance as a family for family night. That's hilarious. And,
Mainly hilarious because everyone in the family can dance except for me. So
it's fun to watch them.
yeah, like I had to take a square dancing class in high school. So that's about the extent of my
Of your dance
dancing
prowess.
ability. So, well, it's almost 8. So we can go ahead and kind of shut it down because we want to honor the schedule for the childcare workers. So if you've been watching on Zoom, if you have specific questions or topics or things like, it would be great to talk about this next week, or boy, I'd love to connect with somebody one-on-one about this topic at a different time. Just email me. It's just mike@suburbanchurch.com. And we can start a conversation. We can loop Martha or Kim or someone into it, and we can kind of figure out what to do from there.
Yeah, and we don't have like a big presentation for next week. We were just thinking we kind of talk through some different issues that maybe we're facing as parents. So again, if you want to shoot us an email or talk now and say, hey, I'd like to learn more about how do you talk about sexuality with your kids, or how do you talk about this, or how do you, that way we could come a little bit more prepared for those conversations. That would be great.
All right.
You want to pray?
Sure. Let's pray. God, thank you for the gift of our children. It is such a huge joy and kind of a big, scary responsibility all at the same time to think, wow, you are inviting me to help care for and shape and mold this little life. And God, we recognize, like, boy, when our kids are little, we're just reminded of how fragile they are and how vulnerable they are, and how you call us to just surround them with love and care for them and protect them and provide for them. But also at some point you have to stop just protecting, and you have to start preparing them to navigate the world that they're going to live in. And that requires wisdom that goes beyond anything we could ever pull off on our own. So we just pray for your wisdom to know how to love and care for our kids well. We pray for your grace, that we would have the grace to forgive ourselves when we mess up, as we will do countless times in the process. And just help us remember, God, that if we can get it right 30% of the time, like science says, that's a pretty good passing grade, because that's something that your grace can help all of us do. So we really just are grateful for the community that we're a part of in you, and that we have an opportunity to learn from each other and to learn from you and your wisdom. So just pray that you would help us all do that well. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, thanks to
Thank
those
you
of
all
you.
being online, yes.
We're going to go ahead and stop the